So what happens if you're a prokaryote? We said for bacteria or prokaryotes, they have no mitochondria. For some of them, oxygen is toxic, so oxygen we don't want to have to deal with, no mitochondria. So how are they going to do this? Well, we said they did. They do cell respiration of a type. It's something referred to as anaerobic because it's no oxygen involved. That doesn't mean that they have to be free of an oxygen environment. It just means they're not going to use oxygen to get energy. So they use glycolysis, as we talked about. Glycolysis, remember, is the first step in cell respiration for you. You and a bacteria are the same to this point. They're going to make 2-ATP and NADH, just like you do. It's glycolysis, no matter what. Now, what you don't do as much is if you make NADH in your cell respiration, NADH is recycled and returned to the glycolysis stage because of the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. But if bacteria don't have an electron transport chain, what are they going to do? They've got to find a way to recycle NADH. And the way they do it is through two different processes. One is lactic acid fermentation. This is actually something that you do. Not frequently, but you do it. And this is the idea of recycling NADH back to NAD+. Okay? But we're going to do it by taking pyruvate and turning it into lactate. This has nothing to do with breastfeeding. Okay? Lactic acid fermentation occurs. It's what some of us refer to as runner's burn, or the burn in your muscles that occurs when you're doing a lot of strenuous activity. It occurs because your system is trying to very quickly recycle electron carriers so that you can break down the next glucose. Okay? So when we look at this buildup in your muscles, it's actually quite dangerous. It's literally an acid that would degrade your muscles over time. But under other circumstances, we've actually harnessed this and made it into something pretty cool. So lactic acid fermentation in dairy is what makes cheese and yogurts. In other examples, we use it to make soy sauce. You turn cabbage into sauerkraut. All these things. Just because you're starting with a glucose of 6 carbons, you go through glycolysis and make 2-3 carbon pyruvates as normal. And you also make our electron carrier. The problem is we've got to recycle this electron carrier. And to recycle it, we actually give the electrons back to pyruvate. And when you take pyruvate and add an electron, which means you're also adding a hydrogen, you get lactate. You've freed up the electron carrier. It goes back to the start, goes all over again, and you've produced another product in this entire reaction. Again, this is only going to occur in you under low oxygen conditions, so when you have a lot of stress and strain on your muscles. Now, alcohol fermentation is the second type of anaerobic fermentation. This is converting pyruvate into ethanol. So you take pyruvate, add those electrons like we just saw with lactate, but instead we're actually going to make ethanol. This is not something that you can do in your cells. I'm sorry. You cannot produce your own ethanol internally. But the whole process is still recycling those electron carriers. So where is this actually occurring? Where does it occur? Yeast. To make bread and beer and wine and other great things. Certainly. Okay? And the process looks very similar to the lactate one I just showed you. You take a glucose with 6 carbons, you make 2 3-carbon pyruvates, and now instead of recycling to lactate, you're actually going to break off another carbon, produce carbon dioxide, which are the bubbles in beer and the bubbles that cause bread to rise, all of these things. And you produce ethanol. Yes, ethanol is produced by yeast in bread, but the baking process burns off the alcohol. So what we look at in beer and wine, though, is that you maintain that alcohol or that ethanol and allow the process to continue with glycolysis feeding these yeast and so on with sugars. Now in nature, we actually have what we call obligate anaerobes. Obligate means you must. Okay, you're obligated to it. These guys are actually poisoned by oxygen. So they have to go through one of these anaerobic fermentation processes. They don't have a choice. They'll die if they don't. Okay? Typically, we see these in low oxygen environments, of course, swamps, deep soils, places like that. Facultative anaerobes means that you can do fermentation or you can go through the process of actually doing oxidative phosphorylation. Remember, yeast is a eukaryote. Eukaryotes have mitochondria. So why aren't the yeast just doing normal cell respiration? Well, they are, but we've trapped them and kind of changed the process in a lot of our baking and winemaking needs and so on to actually slow them down and keep them in glycolysis and in anaerobic fermentation to produce the CO2 and the ethanol. So it's not that they can't do cell respiration. Facultative anaerobes are fine with oxygen. They can do it. They just don't under particular conditions. So glycolysis, we said, evolved very early because we see it in every living organism that we know. We think the process is about 3.5 billion years old. So things have been doing this for a very, very long time. And when we look at its interactions then with aerobic and anaerobic respiration, remember both are going to do glycolysis. It's after that that we go in different directions. So anaerobic respiration doesn't require the oxygen. Aerobic does. It requires mitochondria for our aerobic. No mitochondria are needed for anaerobic. These sorts of things. So think this out for yourselves between two different organisms. So pick a bacteria and pick a eukaryote and think about how it might be different between the two.